pleased to have the participation of Dr. Norman Denzin from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Thanks for participating in our symposium, Public Engagement and the Politics of Evidence in an Age of Neoliberalism and Audit Culture. Now, for those of you who aren't aware, Norm Denzin has written extensively on qualitative methodologies and is famously one of the co-editors with Ivana Lincoln of the Handbooks of Qualitative Research. And we're awaiting the 5th edition, I guess, coming out in 2016. So I don't think you need much more of an introduction, Norm Denzin. You're probably well known to everyone who will see this clip. And thanks again for participating.
Today, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you. Thank you.
Today, I guess we'd like to get started. Maybe if we could unpack a bit the term politics of evidence and what that means. I know you've written about that in the past.
Yes, I think that's a good place to start. I think that term is critical to the whole phase that qualitative inquiry is currently in, because by turning the notion of evidence and surrounding it by the word politics, we're saying that evidence itself is a contested term, and we're pushing back against the notion of science and science in its own evidentiary base as a criteria or a standpoint for evaluating what we do. When we speak of the politics of evidence, then we talk about the structures of power and discourse that put in place a particular set of regulatory practices and criteria that will judge what is evidence, or how can evidence be used then for particular purposes. So the politics of evidence then contests that notion and says that behind it, science is no longer just a neutral apparatus, but it's a structure that is integrated into a larger system of discourse connected to the three crises that your conference is addressing: the crises concerning managerialism, marketing, and measurement, because those three terms are at the core of the crisis that now confronts the qualitative interpretive community, but also the larger global scholarly or university communities. Because while previously we were addressing crises that came from within our own paradigms and our own scholarship and discourse, primarily, although there's some qualifications here, because science has always been a product of a larger global colonial apparatus, which was folded into the structures of capitalism as it connected to the colonial projects of Europe, Asia, and North America. So science has always been part of a larger governmental initiative. But up until the present moment, primarily, at least in the post-paradigm wars of the 60s and the 70s, wars over quantitative, qualitative inquiry, we were struggling internally to resolve those. But since 2000, turning into this new century, in the United States at least, science-based research, no child left behind legislation, the federal government mandating what would count as science and what would count as evidence, that has pushed its way into our community, while the universities themselves have capitulated, so to speak, to the pressures of state and federal government to provide a set of criteria that would warrant or validate the activities that they engage in, that they reward, and that they fund. And so now it's a different moment. We're fighting a war on two sides. One is the pressure down from the neoliberal audit-based university, and then internally within our own communities, our own interpretive qualitative communities, we're fighting against pressures from science-based research, randomized clinical trial protocols, mixed methods initiatives. And then on the other side, within our own community, we're fighting about, well, what is science? What is qualitative inquiry? Whose voice should be heard? How should we hear that voice? So we're moving. So the pressures are coming from two directions at the same time, or more than two directions. And to fight the battlefield on one front is to fight it on the other. But I think what your conference brings to the fore is the centrality of these external, outside the academic pressures that are coming down upon what our qualitative project has always been about.
Sure. Yeah, I wonder, Norman, you're at the cutting edge of a lot of advances in terms of methods and methodology and approaches to viewing and understanding the world. What is exciting you most about what you see coming out? What scholarship is exciting you the most right now?
I think we're moving in several directions at the same time from within the what I would call the qualitative interpretive community, which I connect to the International Congress of Qualitative Inquiry, which is a global project, and your initiative, which is a global project, international. I think so. I'll just list some of the new developments that I think are pushing us forward, and I want to backtrack for a moment and revisit quickly the paradigm wars of the '60s and then the '80s. I was of an age I was trained in the '60s as a sociologist. We had no training as qualitative researchers. In fact, qualitative research didn't exist as a category within sociology. We had something called the Chicago School of Sociology, and they supposedly did something like case studies and they borrowed from anthropologists who were doing participant observation. But we weren't trained in those methods. We weren't trained, at least from the University of Iowa, where I graduated. We were trained in quantitative methodology only. Well, that breaks loose in the '60s, and in the '70s, we get works like the discovery of grounded theory, which is the Glaser and Strauss breakthrough text, which was really, if you read it today, was a positivistic account of how to do research that would satisfy the criteria of an audit culture. It was a pre-audit culture set of toolkit, roadmap. In the '80s, we get the paradigm, the big paradigm war happens between the quants and the quals, so to speak. And Egon Gudba is a major voice, and Ivana is a major voice in that moment, where suddenly it's the discourse coalesces around the notion that we have two incompatible, incommensurate discourses. One's quantitative and one's qualitative. And they can't be measured against each other. They have to be allowed to speak with each other and to have their own autonomy. That was a breakthrough. So that opens up a space for qualitative inquiry. And for 20 years, that's what reigns, is the notion of we have as qualitative researchers, we can write books, we can talk about our methodologies, we can train people on how to do this kind of work or that kind of work, and we're sort of in a new space, a free space. And that's when the whole field explodes. SAGE sort of becomes a small industry publishing qualitative research textbooks. And we're all sort of comfortably thinking the war's over. And we can lean back, and that's the first edition of the handbook, 1994. What's this field all about? It's a separate, complicated discourse. And we can celebrate it. It's got all these paradigms and points of view and methodologies. And it's like the war was over. And we were coasting. We had really won the battle. Well, that holds for a little less than 10 years, because we turn the corner into the next century, and suddenly on the horizon is this science-based research movement, which then is sort of co-opted by the mixed methods movement. And these people come out of nowhere. Or they were there, we weren't listening to them. And suddenly the mixed methods people are saying, well, there's really no difference between quantitative and qualitative. They're just different approaches to the same project. No. But the war that we fought in the '80s paradigm battle was they are different. Right. They are profoundly different. They have different methodological, epistemological, ontological assumptions, and they can't be folded together. Well, that disappears. And so that's what we tried to fight in the 2000 and 2005 editions of the handbook, is that we have to push back against this attempt to sort of fold us into this larger community of mixed methods, which then becomes a handmaiden to the science-based research evidence movement. The two come together, and suddenly, this is the elephant in the living room. We're sort of sitting back thinking we had this battle won, and suddenly it sort of creeps in under the tent, and there it is. So what are we going to do? How are we going to respond to this? And that's sort of where we were, I think, by 2005. How do we engage this? And we're suddenly on the defensive again, caught off guard, so to speak. And that I think it's taken us at least almost a decade to get back on our feet again and decide what is the battle that has to be fought, where are we moving, and so forth. So you say, what are the most exciting new developments? They come now in this post sort of what I call the third moment of pushing back on the one hand and critiquing on the other in more sophisticated ways the mixed methods SBR movement, but then taking the stance that we should no longer be on the defensive. We should no longer be stumbling around trying to write these articles that say, well, of course you can't do randomized clinical trials on human beings. I mean, really, you can't do that. It doesn't work. The model doesn't work. It's never worked. But we've wasted a lot of pages and a lot of ink on critiquing SBR initiatives and all of those, what Kenneth later calls the alphabet soup of different institutional approaches and apparatuses, from the Institute of Educational Studies to the Cochrane Initiative to the Campbell Initiative and so forth. And sort of poking holes in all those approaches, which of course they're obviously there. But we should not be taking on that fight as our major fight. So along the side then, what emerges parallel to this conversation, and you've just mentioned in our earlier conversation getting started today, is the indigenization, the decolonization project, which is sweeping the globe as indigenous communities mobilize themselves through their own critical discourse and educational structures to push back against the colonial apparatus of science, which we are all part of. Right. So that's a major breakthrough, I think, is the indigenization of the academy, the articulation of indigenous methodologies written by indigenous scholars, Maggie Coolidge, Sandy Grande, Linda Smith, Graham Smith, and so forth. There's a long list now. And we did a handbook of critical indigenous methodology where we tried to bring many of those voices together into a kind of overlapping, compatible framework. So that's one major move that's going on, and that in the next decade it will become even stronger, in my opinion. And what's so critical about that is it interrogates from within these notions of evidence, of science, of methodology, of community, but more deeply, or as deeply, it reminds us that science is a moral discourse. It's not a clinical discourse. It's not a discourse based just on evidence, but it's a moral political discourse. And if that's the case, then we need to discuss the implications of any kind of scientific practice morally, ethically, for a particular community and its welfare, and in the relationship between that community, its land, its sacred rituals, its history, its culture, its community leaders, its kinship systems, and so forth and so forth and so forth. So that science now is folded directly into a moral community, which of course it never was under the colonial apparatus or under the post-positive apparatus, because it always came in from the outside and made visible only those things that scientists wanted, that the ethnographer, the interviewer, the traveling scholar would make visible. So that's I think a major intervention right now. Second, there is a growing discourse, and I don't know where I'm going to call post-humanist, post-materialist, post-science. It's informed by Deleuze, by Guattari, by Barat, by Rancière, by a number of different philosophers of science, and Donna Haraway is sort of in the background, Bruno Latour is in the background, the science technology studies are in the background. There's several. It's a rhizomatic movement that draws on several strands: feminism, queer theory, and so forth. But it questions the whole qualitative project as it was formulated under sort of under the umbrella of traditional positivism. That's what Betty St. Pierre's questioning. But then it's moving into, well, what would be a post-humanist, post-qualitative inquiry look like? And here there's a plugging in of terms from Barat and others, and from Deleuze, science without humans, materialism, the materiality of inquiry. We have a long chapter on it in the new handbook by Maggie McClure and Mirko Lensberg, which is a comprehensive sort of laying out that landscape. Now that's a major space, and I think it's fresh. It's drawing on a new set of philosophical arguments, or it's refreshing. It's refurbishing a set of philosophical arguments, and trying to open up a new way of looking at things like data, like analysis, like coding, like interviewing, like observing. Key terms in the traditional qualitative project are being questioned by this group as they try to move us forward into a new sort of re-articulated space of inquiry and what inquiry means. So I don't follow all of it, and I don't agree with all of it. And I did a little piece in the critical studies qualitative methodology, sort of questioning some of it when I talked about the death of data, because these people are still talking about data and what they want to do with data. My argument is that we should draw a line of erasure through the word data, and I don't allow my students to use the word. And if they do use the word in my class, we give them a D hat, the data hat, and they have to sit in the corner with their back to the class, because the word data carries the lingering effects of positivism and of positivistic science and a politics of evidence. So why would we keep that word alive? We need to draw a line of erasure through that. So this is the second major move, the post-humanist, post-materialist approach to inquiry.
What did you replace data with, just to
empirical material. I'm a pragmatist, so I take it from Dewey and James. I use the word empirical material.
Empirical material.
Yeah, and I'm comfortable with that. Empirical lodges me in the world of experience, and material means it can be anything. It can be any trace or any form of representation. I really like the word representation more than data.
Okay.
And I talk about the politics of representation. I think that's what we should be using.
Sure.
The word representation in the politics of representation.
And I interrupted you there. You're about to go to the third.
No. So the third would be, I think there's a, to go back to the word paradigm, there's a paradigm proliferation going on. We now talk, so 20 years ago, we didn't talk about, well, it's a proliferation along several lines. Along the lines of sort of the politics of identity, queer, race, class, ableness, indigenous, gender, all sorts of the intertwining of multiple forms of which the human, the inquirer, is implicated in the world in terms of their situated identity and their biography and their gender and their class and their race. Okay. And the idea that not only do we study the configurations of those identities within the world, but that there are separate discourses themselves connected to those identities. So we have a feminist science. We have a queer theory queers the concept of science. We have an indigenous science. Now, we didn't have this conversation 20 years ago. This wasn't out there. This is a major development. A major move, and it can't be squashed. And there are journals connected to each of those discourses. That's phenomenal. That's very important. And when we come back to this notion of the audit culture and the managerialism that operates in the university and the measurement of productivity and what a scholar does, well, one of the things we have to be able to do is to figure into that set of equations work that goes on in these kinds of journals. Work that represents this kind of discourse, which is not up until the present mainstream discourse, but it's extraordinarily important interventionist discourse that has to be part of the conversation and part of the way in which we measure, if we're going to use that horrible word, a person's productivity or contributions to the scientific community. So this program or paradigm proliferation opens up the space along situated identities on the one side, or however you want it, or a politics of identity. And then within the qualitative space itself, we have, I've just jotted down a few of the discourses that come across our desk with the journals. Arts-based research is getting more and more complicated and more politicized. Critical ethnography, so many in Madison's, the intervention that she is led is getting much more sophisticated. Autoethnography, we now have a special division within the Congress on autoethnography, sort of started by Carolyn Ellis and Art Bacher in the new handbook on autoethnography. There's a rethinking of traditional qualitative methods. Take a journal like Qualitative Research, you'll find articles in every issue rethinking and critiquing things like interviewing, reflexivity, coding, analysis. But this is not rethinking the traditional in terms of some positivistic set of terms, but rather, say, in the hands of Martin Hammersley or Atkinson or Delamont or their students, critically coming in and interrogating how we do the practices that produce these phenomena. So that sort of situated approach to the doing of these more traditional forms of inquiry is also occurring, and that's really an important discourse. So rather than just having journals that report results of qualitative study, we now have journals committed to interrogating the apparatus of doing qualitative inquiry. That's major. That's how we founded the Journal of Qualitative Inquiry. We were less concerned in what people were revealing, but more with how they interrogated the project of doing the project. Right. And that's going to continue, I think. And done in its very best way, the interrogation of the apparatus also makes the world visible in a different way. So content becomes folded into the politics and strategies of representing something. So we're pushing for works that push the envelope in terms of the representation of the world out there. This means different. So under this third development, there are new criteria now operating implicitly in terms of what counts as work that we would think would be moving the project forward in terms of any one of these particular situated interpretive practices, as those practices make the world visible to us. So in the old days, we published research that reported on interviews, and people quoted their interviews, and we quoted from the interviews. And that was the way we did qualitative research. And that's how it was. Now we're not doing that. No, I'm not doing that. Right. Other journals are doing that, but my attempt was always to move it to how do we articulate this critical approach in the deployment of the apparatus? Because the biggest influence on me on this particular argument has been the notion from Stuart Hall that we're always engaged in the politics of representation and making the world visible through a set of situated practices. If that's the bottom line. Sure. That's kind of the bar here that we work from always. And if that's the case, how do we move that bar forward in terms of these particular inquiries? Doesn't matter what you're studying. It's how you move the bar forward. Then there's another set of movements occurring which involve the ethics of inquiry and institutional review boards. They're called different things in different countries. But the federal regulation of the ethics of inquiry, where the government says, we're not going to fund this research unless it's ethically acceptable. So suddenly, and you have to be using methodologies that produce research that we regard as acceptable. So funded research now becomes ethically accepted research using methodologies that are appropriate to the managerial ethic of the larger apparatus. So coming in under the tent of ethics, suddenly what came in alongside it was a regulatory apparatus sort of deregulating positivist research and repressing qualitative research. And on our campus, we had our students doing qualitative research had enormous difficulties for a number of years getting approved by our IRB, our campus level IRB, because it wasn't scientific, which was Yvonne and Lincoln and Gail Cannell have written really powerfully on how these two things these three things tied together: ethics, inquiry, and science. Now, so that's pushed back. And in the most recent report on the protection of human subjects at the federal level in the states is a new document where they're really going that they have responded to this pushback, and they're now curating a new category of research that does not have to be pre-reviewed. If it fits as serious qualitative, whatever that is, qualitative inquiry, it can be excused from research. Well, that's huge.
Okay.
That's huge. That's a recommendation. I think it'll probably be approved. So that means the fight that the oral historians fought for history, which was to get exempted from the IRB review, that fight has now carried over to the rest of us who are doing as if we had to be. This is what I find most depressing about this particular initiative, that we have to legitimate our inquiry in terms of some outside external board made up of on my campus, psychologists and economists and biologists.
Yeah, lawyers as well?
And lawyers, right, lawyers as well, about what's science and what should be done. And it's become such a part of the graduate student culture here that people could spend a semester doing the IRB forms, which is just ridiculous. So this is another pushback, I think. And it's connected to the pushback that, in a sense, comes out of the Indigenous Initiative, because the Indigenous Initiative is saying, we have our own set of ethical protocols and criteria to be adhered to. They're from within our culture. Don't impose your ethics on us. And don't think you can come into our culture, take blood samples, study our kinship systems, and make judgments about how we train and educate our students, our pupils. So these two go together, I think, although they're not necessarily tied together directly.
I think another place where that might enter, I've been excited about participatory and community engaged scholarship, where the outcomes may not even lead to a journal article. The community may decide that it's not a journal article we need, but we need, a report on how best to do this local practice, whatever it is that they've decided is important to them. And to me, that's another area that we need to fight on, that this is legitimate scholarship, even though it doesn't lead to a journal article, let's say.
Right. It's a form of action, of activism, or community involvement.
Sure. And I think there, too, the Indigenous movement, where it's about a relationship with our community. What do we bring to the community? That might lead to better practices, but not a journal article.
Right. I think that's foundational, and that should become part of the review process for any given scholar as they reach out and become involved with this kind of work. No, I think that's really critical. Well, that leads to what I think is another development, which is about it's on the level of policy and government regulation of inquiry and federal boards and federal standards evaluating what is solid or what is acceptable research, but how our work, how qualitative inquiry can become an integral part of the policy process and moved into the policy space, and what that would look like and what that would mean. I think Harry Torrance has written well on this, and he's got his chapter in the last handbook really took up many of the issues surrounding qualitative inquiry and how it gets diminished within the policy arena. So how can we push into the policy arena, like this example with the Indigenous Project, and have a space at the table and have our voices heard at the Congress? Scholars from Latin and South America, from Asia, from New Zealand, from Australia, are all talking about in their local universities how qualitative research is diminished as a presence at the policy level. Well, so this is not just the U.S. or Canada. This is global. So how do we create our own? It's we need to demand a place at the table, and insist that we have that. The Indigenous scholars have been very good at this, as demanding a space at the table. I think it's taken 500 years to get to the table and to get the space, but by God, they've got it now, and I don't think they're going to lose it. So how can we learn from that? Can we become part of that? I don't mean to co-opt anything for a second, but there needs to be a commonly accepted position that critical qualitative inquiry needs to be a part of every conversation at the level of policy. Period. Period. In the U.S., politicians make judgments all the time on single cases and on flimsy evidence, et cetera, but massive changes are done because the politics of evidence folds itself into a particular rhetorical ideological program that the government wants to fund. That's no different from what we're talking about here. I mean, but it is. I mean, we should be part of that conversation as a matter of course. And we need university leaders, we need university presidents, we need deans, we need provosts, we need chancellors committed to this kind of position. And they need to be trained. And they, our trouble here in the States is our administrators, our university administrators all come out of the hard sciences, almost without exception. They're chemists, they're physicists, they're biologists, they're engineers. Maybe a psychologist now and then. They're not English professors, they're not sociologists, they're not people from communications or from history or from ed policy, or they're from the hard sciences, because science has always been the integral part of the governmental of governmentality and the government apparatus. So I think this is not just a utopian dream. Well, it is a utopian dream, but until that power structure is filled with people who have a broader understanding of what science and policy is, I think we're going to only have where this goal is not going to be achieved with any degree of success. Now, I think it may be different in Canada than it is here.
Well, I'm proud to say at least our president is from the Faculty of Education, so
that's terrific.
That's a good sign, I think. Anyway,
yeah.
I wonder. Andrea Smith talks about how we're so good at applying our critical lens outward, but when we go to apply it inward, we seem to shy away from that. So, why have we, as a body of scholars, allowed this audit culture to take such prominence on our campuses? Were we caught sleeping, or what happened? How did the mechanisms work that they were able to?
I think that's a good question. I think we were caught sleeping. I think the tenure promotion apparatus, which is the lifeblood of the whole project, drives everybody into a narrow set of initiatives and projects so they themselves can get tenure. I think we are the larger picture that this whole thing operates in is never brought forward on a continuous basis, because there are all sorts of other things had to be taken into account. I think it's been pushed to the side largely because of that. Now, the idea that science is a moral discourse, that inquiry is a moral discourse, that there's nothing neutral, that it's always political and it's always moral, that's not part of the conversation in the audit managerial university. And it's not that conversation. It happens very infrequently at the level of a department, or a division within a department, or a division within a college. It gets folded into the disciplinary concerns of a particular discipline and its history, and then into the politics of that unit within that unit. So those other issues, I think, push it to the side. Right. And then it's the occasional scholar who sort of speaks out with the one who has tenure to bring it to the fore, possibly. But I think it's your question is very important. And I think it sounds like your university is taking some important steps in this direction. Well, so that I think is encouraging.
we have good guidance from qualitative inquiry conferences and other places now.
So another major initiative is the social justice initiative. The legacy of the protest movements, 2, 3, 4 decades ago, are alive still, and they're alive now within the movements from the situated identity spheres, from the indigenous spheres, and so forth. And I think making that forefront, the social justice initiative, inquiry for social justice or for equity, is something that everybody can get behind and support, and it cuts across all of these other developments, but it can get pushed to the side also. So to privilege the social justice initiative as a way of pushing back against a top-down market managerial measurement apparatus is absolutely pivotal. We could always say, how does this impact the lives of real people in the real world suffering from structures of oppression and inequity? If that's the mantra, that's the byword, and if we keep that in front of us, I think then we can continue to push forward in that direction as well. And that I think that's happening. I think at the level of conferences and congresses and events like the one you're having this summer. Now, to work that into the day-to-day funding apparatus of the campus and the college is another issue. How that happens is up to each particular department in part. But then it's also, where can you get funding that supports social justice initiatives? And then what does that inquiry look like? And then how is that inquiry going to be judged and evaluated, and by whose terms, and so forth? And here there's just huge battles to be fought and to be pushed forward, I would say.
Sure.
So the last initiative, I think, we've gone from quantitative versus qualitative to an enormously variegated, complicated world of what qualitative inquiry is a complex moral discourse. We need to always hold on to that notion. And then we need to recommit ourselves to fighting back against these very terms that you're organizing your conference about. And we need, I think, to re-engage the paradigm wars of the 80s, perhaps not as wars, but to bring forward into the forefront the very terms that we've been talking about this morning, in terms of the proliferation of paradigms, the post-humanist critique, multiple interpretive communities, the influence of qualitative inquiry in the policy arena, what the leadership the moral leadership from indigenous scholars. So it's not now just a war between the quantitative and the qualitative, or the science-based research and the mixed methods people and the qualitative people and the feminists and the queer theorists, and that's just part of the skirmish that's going on. It's the larger project, I think, that we want to hold in our hand, which is, what are we doing in this space? What are our principles and commitments, and where do we want this discourse to take us? What's the utopian vision we have for critical qualitative inquiry? And how can these these old battles inform our struggles today, but how can we escape from those old battles and not get tangled, not repeat them, but create a new conversation with a new set of utopian hopes and dreams? Now that we have really weathered a series of attacks, if I could use that word, we're on the other side of the SBR project, on the other side of the mixed methods project, I think, and so let's take stock. And like the Congress theme this year is reimagining or constructing a new critical qualitative inquiry. It's from this. That's what I'm talking about. We're 11 years into the Congress. we're 30 or 40 years past the original paradigm dialogue. And so where do we go now? What can we do? That's the challenge that your conference is giving us, I believe.
Sure. I'm hoping we reinvigorate a reclamation of our our collective collegial autonomy. That's what I think. As a body of scholars, we need to fight back against new management technologies and externally imposed audits that are narrow in their framework and measure outputs in such a limiting way, in such a positivist way. I think that as a body of a collective of scholars, we need to take back our own governance. I'm hoping that at QI and at the symposium this summer, we're able to act as a support group for each other and organize together, saying, enough. We got to push back,
collaborate, cooperate, and mutually empower. Have an ongoing global conversation,
and maybe stop looking at each other with skepticism about who's worthy and who isn't, and start working together and to make each other stronger. Obviously, healthy skepticism is good.
But, exactly.
But not this sort of. I always kind of liken it to a bully in the playground that we have to stand up and say that each of us gets to play with the ball.
Right, it's a Big Ten, and nobody's going to control the ball. That's right. No, yeah. I think that's a nice model. Yeah, exactly.
But
exactly.
So, if I asked you the greatest 3 threats and the greatest 3 areas of hope, would you be able to answer that, or would you not like to be limited to 3?
Well, I would like to see greater commitment to this notion that science is a moral discourse. Period. And we accept it when we push it aside. So I think bringing that to the forefront, a renewed commitment to the politics of representation. How do we make things visible? And then a commitment to a social justice agenda. That those are this is a moral discourse. It revolves around a politics of representation that makes the world visible in a way that allows us to address issues of social inequity and social justice. And if those 3 things could become a rallying point for us, I think this global community would then have the principles that it could take to any site and implement. So it's not tied to a specific set of demands, but rather these are principles before personalities, or principles before specific issues. But they give us guideposts to move forward. Those would be my 3 wishes, I think, and I believe your conference is moving us, in significant steps towards that direction.
Well, I do. I want to thank you so much for agreeing to participate and to contributing to the symposium and to the discourses and conversations we need to have about furthering the way forward. And also, Dr. Norm Denzin, I want to thank you for all your work over the years. It's meant so much to my own work, and I'm sure to so many scholars around the world. We look forward to the 5th edition of that qualitative handbook, and you've been such a great mentor and so generous with your time. We thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Marc. I'm honored by this opportunity to speak to you and to your colleagues, and I wish everybody well at this wonderful conference this summer. Thank you.
Thanks again.
Okay.